Hi, I'm Mark, and today I want to talk about Brexit. What a surprise, isn't it? UK support for EU re-entry has jumped 4% to 61% in a week. And nevertheless, the British will not be members again anytime soon. But more Britons regret leaving the EU. The latest survey by the market research institute Omnisys shows that 61% want to rejoin the EU. That is 4% more than in the last survey a week ago. The British decided on Brexit in 2016 with a majority of almost 52%. Brexit has exacerbated many of the country's structural problems. These include, among other things, a large emigration, a decline in investments, and increased hurdles in foreign trade. The international free trade agreements from which one had hoped so much have not yet come about. The country has plunged into poverty, and many people have to decide whether to eat or to heat. The government has announced that it has paid £130 million in cold weather payments to 5 million households in England and Wales over the winter. Inflation was 10.4% in February. That's more than anywhere else in Western Europe. Chaotic conditions also prevail in the NHS health system. The NHS is on the brink of collapse in many places. There are illnesses and deaths partly because there are no ambulances or the patients have to wait for many hours in front of the clinics and the emergency rooms. After the corona pandemic had obscured the consequence of Brexit for a while, they are making themselves felt with twice the force with the war in Ukraine. The population has realized that the promises associated with Brexit will not be fulfilled, at least in the short to medium term. The Brexit drivers, above all former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, would have discredited themselves through political incompetence and, of course, as well, personal misconduct. Following the latest poll, former Belgian Prime Minister Guy Verhofstadt, who was also the EU Parliament's chief Brexit negotiator, he sneered on Twitter, impressive result and very indicative of the mood in the country. Brexit has let everyone down. It's time to get back in. Brussels has repeatedly emphasized that the return of Great Britain to the EU would be welcomed. I see that very differently, but okay. Michel Barnier, the EU's Commission's former chief Brexit negotiator, said at the beginning of the year, "The door on the EU side will always be open for you and a few others." He explicitly meant Switzerland and Norway. However, experts do not see a re-entry coming anytime soon. There are still too many influential forces in the country who want to prevent this at all cost. And the Labour Party, which has so far been able to capitalize little on the problems of the Conservative government except in the polls, is not consistently pro-European. In addition, with a surprising resignation of Scottish First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, a strong voice for Scottish independence and the pro-EU course was silenced. It will be more of a slow rapprochement in very small steps. A process would be conceivable in which, when something, when the grass has grown over the exit, some tariff relief and the like, and would be agreed to mitigate the worst consequences and ease the situation for the economy. There are some signs of rapprochement, such as the visit by EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, that in connection with the Northern Ireland Compromise. In addition, Russian President Vladimir Putin is also ensuring more intensive contacts between London and Brussels. His war in Ukraine has welded Western countries even closer together, instead of dividing them, as he expected. Brexit is short for British exit and refers to the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union. The UK held a referendum on its membership in the EU. The referendum on whether to leave the EU was announced by former UK Prime Minister David Cameron in February 2016. The vote took place on June 23rd in 2016, with 72.2% of eligible voters turning out to cast their ballots. The Leave campaign, led by figures such as Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage, won by a margin of 51.9% to 48.1%. The formal process of leaving the EU began on March 29th in 2017 and was completed on January 31st in 2020. After the referendum, the UK government triggered Article 50 of the Treaty on the European Union, which set out a 2-year timeline for negotiating the terms of the UK's departure from the EU. However, this deadline was extended several times due to ongoing negotiations and disagreements. The negotiations between the UK and the EU were often tense and complex, with key issues including the future of trade relations, immigration, and the Irish border. The UK officially, as I said, left the EU on January 31st in 2020, and a transition period began, during which the UK remained part of the EU Single Market and Customs Union. But this ended on December 31st in 2020, and a new trade agreement between the UK and the EU was finally agreed on December 24th that year. But Brexit has had significant economic consequences for the UK, including a decrease in investment and in economic growth, as well as job losses in some sectors. However, supporters of Brexit argue that leaving the EU will ultimately benefit the UK by allowing it to control its own laws, borders, and trade policies. Brexit, indeed, had significant economic and political implications for the UK and the EU. The UK and the EU had to negotiate new agreements on trade, but also on security and other issues, and that also happened on December 24th in 2020 then. The UK has also implemented new immigration policies and regulations, and the border between Northern Ireland, which is still part of the UK, and the Republic of Ireland, which is an EU member, has been a major issue in those negotiations. Brexit will still have an economic impact on the UK, and according to the UK's Office for Budget Responsibility, leaving the EU is likely to reduce the UK's economic output by 4% in the long run. And this has led to a decrease in investment and economic growth, as well as job losses. But businesses have also been hit hard by the uncertainty surrounding Brexit, with some moving operations out of the UK to other EU countries. And since the UK left the EU, trade and supply chain disruptions have become more common. Many UK businesses have faced difficulties exporting goods to the EU, with new customs checks and paperwork causing delays and increased costs. This has particularly impacted businesses that rely on just-in-time supply chains. The UK has also lost access to EU funding for research, infrastructure, and other projects. This has had a significant impact on universities, research institutions, and other organizations that relied on this funding. Brexit has also impacted the rights of UK and EU citizens. UK citizens living in the EU and EU citizens living in the UK have had to apply for residency status, with some facing difficulties and delays in the process. And this has led to uncertainty and anxiety for many people in that time. The issue of the border between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland has, as I said, been a major point of contention in the Brexit negotiations. The border is now an external EU border, which has led to the introduction of customs checks and paperwork, but in the Irish Sea instead of there. And this has created tension and difficulties in Northern Ireland, which has a complex history of political conflict. And so Brexit will not make anyone's life more easy. As I said, I found one Brexit benefit with the marmalade, but that really is everything I've found so far. And about Guy Verhofstadt, I know many Brexiteers love him dearly. I'm not as optimistic as him with the EU wanting the UK back, at least not in the short term, and at least not with that government. I cannot imagine that to happen from either side. And I'll see you in my next video. I'll be back.